Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jacob Tischer, who is the Global Taiwan Chair at Charles University in Prague in the Czech Republic. Jacob is also an anthropologist, and so we're going to get into a conversation around his career in anthropology as well as some research and publications that he has written on the topic of pilgrimages. Before we do all that, though, I'd like to hear a little bit about your current role at Charles University and what that looks like and how you are melding your interest in Taiwan with anthropology in this position.
Thank you, Heather. So yeah, I was actually hired to teach about Taiwan, which is a pretty rare opportunity. Like you don't have a lot of positions like this. In Europe, I think there's maybe 3 or 4 positions like it. And all of those are assistant professorships typically. So that's what I am, assistant professor. I started more than a year ago after finishing my PhD in 2024 at Boston University. Mm, what teaching about Taiwan kind of means, it gives me a lot of freedom. I can teach kind of what I'm interested in. I am supposed to also teach a little bit about the political side of being Taiwan, which means I have to focus on cross-strait relations, even though that's not my expertise. So oftentimes I invite speakers, guest lecturers who come and talk about those topics that I'm not too familiar with, because I focus on religion and Taiwan, and religion in particular in the Czech Republic. I don't know if everyone is aware of that, but the Czech Republic is one of the most secularized places in the world, where only 15% of the people say they go to church regularly. So it's kind of teaching about religion is actually the harder part than teaching about Taiwan, because the Czech Republic has pretty strong, or at least in the last few years, has had a relatively strong connection to Taiwan, especially Prague, because Prague is sister cities with Taipei. There are direct flights. So a lot of the students that I get are actually very aware and conscious of the Taiwanese situation. And they kind of connected to the Czech one because, both of them were or are under the irredentist, imperialist motives of a large power in their neighborhood. So that's where a lot of people connect to Taiwan, actually. In public discourse, like, a lot of people know about this. I was quite surprised because I feel like this knowledge is deeper entrenched than it is in Germany, for example.
Within your role, do you host students who are from Taiwan? Is there a robust exchange, or what does this mean for the institution, Charles University, to be so focused on this area, this region of the world, and kind of what does that look like in terms of student demographics and also the types of programs or classes that are created as part of your role?
So we do have some students who come from Taiwan, but the institutional framework and exchange students, that's not a lot of places. In my classes, I only get 1 or 2 students. Last semester was actually 3, 4 students that I had, but that was an outlier in the 3 semesters that I have been teaching. Uh, but so the same for the Czech students going to Taiwan. So if you're in the Institute of Chinese Studies, Sinology, learning the language is a really important component of that. And that requires going to Taiwan or China for an extended period of time. So that's what students always, they have to find an opportunity to do that. Many of our students go to Taiwan on government scholarships offered by the Republic of China, which is Taiwan's official name. I just had earlier this month, I had 4 students come to me for recommendation letters, and those were all for applications they had for a scholarship to go to Taiwan for language studies. So that's what they typically do. The Taiwanese students who come to the Czech Republic, there was one student I had who did Bohemian studies, but I think that exists only in one university in Taiwan. Other than that, we do have university to university exchanges or faculty to faculty. And those bring one or two students here or there across, but not more than that. So usually when I teach, that means I teach Czech students and Erasmus students, so international students from other countries in Europe. And Prague is quite attractive for students from across Europe. So we get a lot of Erasmus students with varying degrees of knowledge, but especially students, for example, from Ireland, they can kind of connect to that issue that Taiwan is facing. So um, I teach in English. I teach a variety of classes that focus on popular culture, religion, some politics. I always draw that connection to politics, but I focus, for example, this semester I focus on memory and the making of memory, and through what kinds of media products, especially memory, is made. And that gets interest from students, mostly the Czech Republic, our students, but sometimes here or there you get a student from a different institution in the university or from another country.
So, how does a person who grew up in East Germany take up an interest in anthropology and Taiwan in specific?
Yeah, that's a good question. Anthropology first, maybe, because that came earlier. Um, I think this is kind of in school already. Like I was always interested in other cultures. I knew I wanted to study religions, so I decided for religious studies. But the way that our programs were made up, you had to choose at least two majors or one major, two minors. And so I had to combine religious studies with two other or one other subject. Anthropology was kind of one that was close because, studying culture is very close to studying religion. And I was interested in both and not necessarily only in religion. And then I had to decide, which region to study. And meeting with one of the lecturers in religious studies, he suggested that I try China. And that was really what started it. So I began learning Chinese and, start with Chinese studies. It was fun because you can track your progress every week. You know what new characters you're learning. It's really cool, especially if you like, if you have a if you have a good ear for the tones is one thing. The other thing is if you like drawing characters, it's a lot of fun this way too. And I went to Taiwan kind of because I won a scholarship. I won the same scholarship that my students are applying for, essentially, to spend a year in Taiwan. And yeah, that's kind of how I got stuck in Taiwan. Is because going there for the first time was a really good experience because it's a very interesting island, of course, for its history and the political side of things, but also people are incredibly friendly and it's just a very pleasant place to be as well. And, having been there for a year, I met friends, so you kind of develop a connection and that continued to grow over the years.
Before we get into talking about the research and the writing that you've done on
Hmm.
pilgrimages within a Taiwanese context, it might be helpful for you to give an overview of some of the religious infrastructure that we might think about these pilgrimages within. Um, I know we're going to talk a little bit about the nationalism side of the pilgrimages, but are there pieces of the religious framework that help us understand how we can understand the pilgrimages broadly from a religious perspective?
Yeah, I think what I find important every time I point this out also to students is you have to kind of set aside the world religions framework for this because that's typically what my students approach religion with is kind of you have distinct bodies that are centrally institutionalized and people identify it as belonging to one or the other of them, but usually not to more than one. So it's kind of the model of Christianity and especially Protestant Christianity that serves as the role model. In Taiwan's, it was very quickly clear to me that this doesn't really apply because people participating in the same event would could say totally different things about, what it means or what they think they are, or, where they see themselves belonging. So you could say, oh, this is Buddhist or this is Taoist. And those, of course, if you come from a world religions framework, these are two different things. They shouldn't be, or there have been debates between proponents of both. And of course, there's been some syncretism over time, but people still think of them as separate. But here in this everyday lived framework, people would kind of say one or the other without really distinguishing or kind of what this means. They might also call a deity Taoist or Buddhist, kind of, without really this without really reflecting on what's the difference between those two terms. It's kind of more, I think it's often actually more, they would say it more thinking about what terms they think I'm familiar with, what I would know about this context. This is one of the reasons why I went from religious studies to anthropology, actually, because I found the religious studies framework a little limiting when it comes to popular religion. So what I do, the pilgrimages that I studied, we would call this popular religion, but popular religion is also something really fuzzy. It's not something that is neatly defined, and it's not something that is recognized as a form of religion outside of, let's say, Buddhism or Taoism. So you could talk about popular religion as something that people do when they're not properly Christian or something like that. Superstitions are often thrown in there, or kind of, remnants from earlier practices and things like that. In Taiwan, popular religion is kind of I would call it just the default of what people do. So the majority of people who are not experts in anything, who are not, dedicated, converted Buddhists, for example, they would participate in activities like ancestor worship, which is something that, you get to continue as through the family. So you kind of have to participate because your parents make you participate from a young age. That is part of popular religion. By extension, it is participating in the communal religious aspects of, the family, within families embedded. And this communal aspect is that also organizes the pilgrimages, actually, because pilgrimages are organized by um, an organization that is usually centered around a temple, affiliated with a temple, and then organizes the pilgrimages to another temple. And these temples represent a community of people. They're not usually private shrines, but more like, a congregation based. They have their own territory, actually. So this popular religion is very everyday. It's really connected to what people do in everyday life. And it doesn't really require a lot of, that's the other thing that sets it apart from the world religions framework. It doesn't really require um, faith or, kind of this identity based type of belonging. But it's more like, so long as you participate, you practice in practice, um, you're welcome to, or it's actually better if more people practice. So it's just like, as many people as possible. That's the goal. Bring in as many as possible. So long as you participate, for me, this was never a problem. People would assume that I'm Christian, but so long as I participate in the practices, there's no question there. It's kind of, people get curious about this, of course, but they would never question my participating in it. And this participation based um, framework, to me, also puts it kind of in something that's broader than religion as a clearly distinguished area of life, but it really seeps into everyday life in general. So it's kind of, culture is another word where we kind of reify something. And I don't know if it's so much, if it's a better term really, but popular religion is kind of, it really fizzles out into the economy, into politics, into all of this. So the representatives of people who organize pilgrimages are often also politicians or business people. So they're not really only religious or primarily religious caretakers. They often do this kind of in order to enhance the other functions they have, the other roles they play, such as political roles. And I actually focused in some of the something that has been published, I focus on kind of how also mafia bosses could be involved in this and could be involved in the organization of pilgrimages.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly here. The pilgrimages, I'm feeling a little it feels very general, but so these pilgrimage iterations are occurring with groups of people who start at one temple and go to another temple.
Usually, yes.
And they take place like in duration. I'm imagining it's less than 1 day.
That really depends. The majority of pilgrimages last about 7, 8 days. And then,
Oh,
but there's longer ones too.
okay.
So yeah, 7, 8 days is kind of the big ones. These are the Dajia and the Baishatun pilgrimages. They each last, I think it is like 7 days, 8 nights. But then I participated in one that was 40 days long, for example. I was walking around Taiwan for 40 days. So there's other formats too. And there's shorter ones too that are just a day or two.
And these collectively, uh, they're similar in the practices, and they're collectively known as pilgrimages. I mean, what's the word?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So thank you for bringing this up because, of course, there is no one by one translation. The word that we recognize as meaning pilgrimage nowadays is jinxiang. Jinxiang is to present incense. There's kind of to bring incense from one place to another. Um, that incense kind of what's a good word for that? Incorporates or kind of takes in the meaning, because the incense is essentially a culmination of the power of divine power of a deity. So when people bring incense, they take it along on the pilgrimage. They bring kind of the incense burner and refill it with new incense from the the destination temple, because the destination temple, what sets a pilgrimage apart from other forms of processions and visits, is the destination temple is of a higher status than the visiting temple or shrine of the group that visits. So it recharges the other shrine, the other temple, the other deity image. Because the pilgrimages are essentially return visits this way, because they are organized about every year, ideally, returning to a place of origin. So the way this worked was that temples would split up, would set up branches in a way, by people bringing a deity image from a temple and bringing incense with them to a new place where they emigrated to. So they would often, this is through immigration, from leaving from one place to another and then building a new temple there, putting the image, the deity image, adding the incense, and then they would periodically come back in order to recharge the deity. They would also frame it as, the deity would get to see her parents. I'm looking at Mazu pilgrimages especially, and Mazu is a female, is a goddess. So she would visit her parents. She would visit her sisters along the way, which are temples of equal standing, and then she would rest, basically visit her parents, then return to her own temple.
What is the origin of this practice?
Oh, that's actually, I think it's pretty hard to say, but so sociologically, it would be this kind of network of distribution of temples. How old that practice itself is, I actually don't really know. The majority of these types of practices come from the Song dynasty onwards, so they would be at most about 1,000 years old, which is already quite old, but it pilgrimages, of course, they change in shape. We do have historic records of pilgrimages, of these kinds of visits, jinxiang, of presenting incense, um, over a long period of time. But I think they might change in the precise nature of how it plays out, what is meant by them. Also, the pilgrimages that I'm looking at that are happening in Taiwan are not representative of practices all over China. They come from, so there's close similarities with Southeast China, but other parts of China have other types of practices, and there might be pilgrimages that look different there as well, especially if Buddhism is more institutionalized there, or other forms of Muslim practices, for example. So it's relatively specific to that area, Fujian and Taiwan.
How does a person learn about the pilgrimage? How do they know that it's going to occur?
So most of the people who I know, they always know. It's kind of hard for me how they learn about it, but so this is on social media. Um, it's always happening around the same time. It's before the birthday of the goddess Mazu, which is on the 23rd of the third lunar month. So it shifts every year depending on when that falls on the solar or our calendar. Um, but it's approximately in March, April, maybe to May, that time period. So you can expect it to happen around then, and then it's kind of everywhere. Like these, especially the big pilgrimages, get announced on social media. You have them in the news. It's really hard to escape that. Actually, that information, I would say, it's much harder to find information about smaller pilgrimages. So that's when you have to really look for information on social media, for example. So one of the pilgrimages that I participated in during PhD fieldwork was over the New Year period, the Lunar New Year celebrations. It was in the end of January 2020. And I learned about this through a friend who pointed me to a Facebook page. And then I got in touch with the group, and I had to organize going there, um, and kind of register with them. I think that's how people typically find out. You either look up that information or you hear word of mouth. Yeah.
So the pilgrim learns in some way through formal or informal networks that
Mhm.
this return of incense is going to occur. The movement of the pilgrim then is to join a group at one temple, and then the group moves together to the next temple? Or is this are different groups moving to different temples kind of starting at the same time?
Um, so that of course can also happen, but they wouldn't organize together. So they wouldn't. So it's not, if you have one organizing body, that pilgrimage is one unidirectional. It would be the same. They would all go because it's about the deity, where the deity is going, where the deity's moving in the Sudan chair, carried by 4 or 8 people, depending on how heavy the chair is. And this is the center of the pilgrimage. So that everyone who participates follows that Sudan chair with the deity. Um, that said, in the bigger pilgrimages, like the Dajia or Baishatun pilgrimages, you register as a participant. You get your equipment, which in the Baishatun case is kind of like a orange cap, a vest, and some other things. And then you can go as an individual, or you can go with a group of people who all want to participate in that pilgrimage. So what I did was, um, I would ask friends of mine who wanted to come, and then we would we went together. We met at the origin temple, the place where it starts. Would meet up there and then would walk together, and we would stay as a group. But we might be, sometimes you're faster than other pilgrims, sometimes you're slower. You also get to know other pilgrims along the way. It's always a big group. Uh, to give context, that Baishatun pilgrimage is more than 100,000 people. So it can be up to, by now, 180,000 people who are actually registered. So this doesn't even include people who come for just a one day, or who are curious and just walk along for a little bit. Um, so you kind of walk a bit like at your own pace with your own small group, but then always kind of coming together. There's this mix of contraction and dispersion during the pilgrimage, because at certain ritual high points, most people would come together because they want to see what is happening at this temple at night. And then you'd kind of disperse a little bit until there's um, another event happening. But there's always a lot of people around. Like you're never truly alone during that type of pilgrimage. The smaller ones are much more cohesive in the sense that, people know each other and they kind of stick together. And because you have to switch roles. You kind of have to, you have to continue to help carry the sedan chair, and then you have to switch and you do something else until it's time again to help out with a role. So it's especially if you have only 20 people in a group, that's all organized together. You sleep together in the same dormitory, basically. You rise together, you walk together, you eat together. Um,
The incense that is carried from one shrine to another, one temple to another, is this is it one container of incense, or do the individual pilgrims bring their incense as one, or this is a collective um, container or vessel of incense?
there's a possibility of both. There has to be a more collective one because that's the official one. That's
Mhm.
that's the one by the organizing temple or an institution that participates in the organization. They will bring their own, and it's also carried usually in a type of sedan chair, so it has its own um, seat of respect and power, and it's locked off for the duration of the pilgrimage until it gets refilled. But individuals might also bring their own um, containers with incense or things that they bring in order to kind of let pass them through the incense. So most pilgrims has something that they will want to pass over the burning incense in the destination temple in order to purify it or recharge it, and they could take like little bits of incense home after a pilgrimage, or home, or to share with others. That is possible.
What types of objects do people bring with them to pass through the incense, and what do they hope will happen uh, through this contact with the incense?
So it can be miniature representations of a deity. It can be their own deity. So some people have their own. Um, I call them deity bodies because they are inhabited by Mazu. If it's the goddess Mazu, for example. Um, so it's not just an image or an icon. It's meant to be active, actually, agentic. So in that sense, it it benefits from recharging every once in a while. So some people might bring their own and then pass it over the incense of the destination temple in order to recharge it. It doesn't have to be a deity image. They Pilgrims typically have flags and other types of smaller items that they bring along. They often collect small giveaways, trinkets from temples along the way. The flags are really important because this is kind of, you collect them and these identify you as a pilgrim. They identify you as kind of, which temple you belong to. And they are also kind of, they have the word divine in the name, Shenxi, which they're not deities themselves, but they are connected with the divine. So this is something that you can pass over incense fire as well. Um, yeah, this is mostly other practices, but if a person participates in the pilgrimage for a specific purpose, such as helping a relative recover from illness or something like that, they might also bring something like clothing that might is supposed to either be charged with positive energy or cleansed from negative energy. And this could be like, for example, if a child is not doing well, it could be clothes belonging to that child to be passed over the incense in order to help the child recover in that case.
What have participants or pilgrims told you about the particular meaning that happens because of this pilgrimage, or the effect of it? Are do they in the case that you just mentioned, of
Mm.
the child not doing well, um, did you learn later that this practice actually helped the child? I'm curious about what you have learned about the after effects of these pilgrimages.
Um, I don't have any concrete case where, somebody went in order to heal or to have somebody else healed, but from at least from general experience of what people say about this and in other contexts, um, there's usually uh, what should I call it? So typically, yes, there will be an effect. People see an effect at least, that because if there isn't an effect, then you did something wrong. So it's
Oh,
always
okay.
possible to
So
find explanations that you didn't do it properly, or you have to go somewhere else, or the goddess did what she could. There's always this possible explanation that she only has certain powers. The gods are not omnipotent, so they can do certain things, but um, they this also has potentially has limitations. So people find explanations for that too. But for other effects, um, what's a common effect? So the way I see it is that people talk about building a personal relationship. That's kind of how I would frame it, because that's oftentimes how people talk about this. So it's not kind of a it's not purely transactional. This is actually that's a common idea about religion in Taiwan, that it's pragmatic, transactional. There certainly are elements to this, transactional elements, but what I found was that people develop relationship, they develop an effective type of belonging to Mazu as a person who they relate to, who they can confide in, and who they kind of build a relationship with that actually grows stronger and stronger over time. So this is someone that you can ask for if you're in terms of need, or in times of when you're not doing so well. It's kind of almost like someone who is at your side. It helps to know that the goddess Matsu is, most people understand her as a grandmother. So they see her as an extension of the family, and a female figure who is kind of on the older side, a grandmother. And the grandmother has positive connections for most Taiwanese, because when they were young, a lot of Taiwanese kind of spend time with their grandparents, sometimes even are raised by their grandparents for the first few years of their lives. And it's the grandparents who are they're kind of intermediaries between the parental generation and the religious participant, or like the current generation of Taiwanese, where there's some conflicts between parents and children, because parents have expectations of their children, and often um, the children find it harder to meet those expectations, especially now with the economic situation often worsening for them. But the grandparents, you don't have such potential antagonism, conflict there. With grandparents, and especially grandmothers, usually a very um, effective and positive effect that people can connect with her. And that is kind of by extension, this goes for Matsu. And so I think the effect that people feel is that they feel closer, and they build this up over time. And it's just something that at some point they don't really want to do without. So it's not really like there's other alternatives. Oh, let me try out a different god now. This happens pretty rarely, I think. It might be another Matsu in a different temple that you feel closer to, but usually that is because that Matsu, you find it more helpful. You find her more helpful, and you find her kind of more effective in this way.
yeah, it seems like people would feel cared for or nourished or affirmed if this was the relationship that they had with their own grandmother. I can see
Hmm.
where this is an important uh, part I mean, it's a human need for to feel this way, and if people are gaining this kind of sense of being cared for through this pilgrimage, I imagine it's a very important part of life.
Yeah, I certainly I would say so. Um, what I'm what surprised me from going on pilgrimage was often how relatively so I don't want to underestimate the religious component of it, but often I met quite a few people who were quite nonchalant or relatively agnostic about the religious side, and they took it as a cultural event. Um, and I call this, to get to know Taiwan, because there was this component of, using the pilgrimage as a way to find connection with Taiwan in a geographic sense, but also in a social sense as a community of people, and to feel some form of belonging to Taiwan. And that, pilgrimages provide kind of they're one of the few institutionalized mechanisms, cultural mechanisms, through which people can actually experience the nation. So to experience kind of a community that goes beyond just, the neighborhood or kind of the people who you interact with, because this is people from everywhere in Taiwan that go on these pilgrimages. So you get a picture of all of Taiwan. Plus, there is this idea among many pilgrims that you actually get to see a better side of Taiwan, because you get to see the countryside where there's, this idea is it goes back to Raymond Williams, and with, the kind of authenticity of the nation state residing in the countryside in England, in like this idea coming up in the 19th century. And this idea is also relatively strong in Taiwan, where um, young people see that in the pilgrimage, you get the best of Taiwan, basically. You get good people who volunteer, because there's a lot of volunteers on the side of the road who donate food, drink, help, first aid services, toilets, um, and they're all there for the same purpose. So it's all kind of in this pursuit of, Mazu. Mazu kind of as a focal point there, thereby unites those who come with her and who help on the side of the road in one kind of community, in one large collective of people. So it's for this, to feel this, to experience the connection with other Taiwanese, that you wouldn't normally have the opportunity of having that connection, especially if you live in the cities with their busy lives. That draws a lot of younger people, especially. And this is where I see connections with other exploratory forms of travel, where pilgrimages are inspiring forms of, traveling around Taiwan, because sometimes this merges when you have pilgrimages that lead around the entire island of Taiwan. It's called Huandao. So it has a name, rounding the island, because it's a phenomenon. It's a social phenomenon among younger people. Some people do it by bike, motorbike, other people on foot, like this 40-day pilgrimage that I mentioned. This is kind of where this really connects the idea of actually learning where you come from and doing this in service with the deity, which if you're a religious person organizing this type of pilgrimage, you can easily justify it by spreading the name of the temple of that, or the Mazu. Is called Hongfa, and this kind of, to spread the dharma of this particular deity, and that's relatively common reason for organizing a larger pilgrimage. And so the travel is kind of similar to secular forms, where there's kind of a bit of a continuum, I would say, between them.
I'm thinking about Carl Jung's work on archetypes, and in particular the archetype of the Great Mother, and the mother inhabiting uh, shrines and inhabiting especially the earth. And so it's interesting to hear that a focus of these pilgrimages also connecting with the actual geography, and maybe sacralizing it in some way through the act of the pilgrimage. And of course, Mazu herself is this great mother figure. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about this, if you had explored Jung's work, or kind of conceptualized your own work in light of this.
I have not, but it very much sounds kind of. It's not the only place where I think you have the mother trope
Yes.
playing an important role. Uh, I've, Oftentimes this comes up in secularized discourse, like Mother India is a prominent example. And I don't know if there are pilgrimages in honor of Mother India, but the form of pilgrimages taken, I think, in India is there's similar large scale events. Um, so I haven't approached it from this way because I was looking mostly at the affective side. Um, the mother being or the grandmother. I don't know if mother and grandmother, if there's actually if there's a difference there for people, or if that is an important part of it. But I think that a lot of people really think of Mazu as an extension of the family is quite interesting, and something that you don't really get where there's in societies where you have a hard separation between the empirical and the non-empirical, or where there are no ancestors around any longer, but they reside in heaven or something like that. That's harder to gain that close connection, and I think that for me is the more I find that the an interesting connection. With archetypes themselves, I haven't really thought about this or I haven't tried to connect it, in part also because I think probably because of disciplinary boundaries,
Mhm.
because in anthropology, at least I didn't have classes on the psychology of religion. So we didn't really explore it very much, even though I can see that it actually resonates quite a bit, especially with your description of
And I'm also
the mother.
thinking the mother and the homecoming and return that
Mhm.
you have written about seem to be important pieces that are interrelated to this great mother archetype. Can you say
Yeah,
any
yeah.
more about this idea of return and coming home, which was the partially formed the title of one of your papers, "Coming Home to Taiwan"? What does that mean in your work?
Yeah, so that is how I try to encapsulate the experience of, or the actually the motivations for why many people go on pilgrimage. Um, and to give context to this, I should say that I think probably most people who listen to this will be, or who watch this, will be aware of the complications of the political situation in Taiwan, um, and might have heard of the difficulty of uh, how exactly to place Taiwan in relation to China in terms of the identification of its people. Because, of course, Taiwan is officially called the Republic of China. Uh, the People's Republic of China has a claim on Taiwan as part of its territory, meaning there is already a very strong connection. Culturally speaking, most people who live in Taiwan are descended from people who at some point came across the Taiwan Strait from China. And so for them to explore the relationship, or the notion of home, is actually a tricky one. It's not just convoluted, but it's also beset by political issues, because there's this whole thing of there's a belligerent country. So what could be an ancestral country is actually also has taken a belligerent stance towards the idea that the Taiwanese might want to think of themselves as separate from the People's Republic of China. So the idea of homecoming here is also, I try to trace how that home is actually changing, and especially since it's a contested term, it's not clear where home exactly is. That elevates the importance of pilgrimages as practices that allow people to experience a sense of home. So that perhaps to say, the change of the notion of home here is kind of moving from the ancestral home in China, where most families can trace their family's background to some place in China. And pilgrimages in the 1990s, especially, once travel links were opened between Taiwan and China, a lot of people from Taiwan went to China in order to explore their roots. So you have this kind of root-seeking, home-seeking type of mainland fever, it was called at the time. And pilgrimages were an important part of that because temples would also recreate or retrace their links with temples in China, where, they would find historic documents that stated that, oh, our first Mazu came from this temple or that temple. And then they would go on a visit and create this, renew this link of affiliation. Oftentimes, this could be used in Taiwan in order to enhance their own status as temples and kind of, because the temples compete with each other. There's a lot of them. They compete for this population of pilgrims, of donors. Um, so visits to China at this time were an important cultural capital for temples in Taiwan. But with the 2000s and especially the 2010s and kind of relations becoming increasingly hostile, and especially the rhetoric coming from the CCP being hostile, newer generations of pilgrims have focused on Taiwan. And, those who I met who had gone to China in search of home, or they didn't use the word home. So it was kind of in search of something, or, because of curiosity, perhaps. They would do it once to satisfy their curiosity, and that's kind of about it. But they would go on pilgrimages in Taiwan every year. So there's a difference. Like home is what is familiar, and what if you go every year, this is kind of, this is a clear, without having to enunciate it, is a relatively clear statement as to, what you're familiar with, where the family resides and what is home. Um, so if there had been once the potential of return visits to China becoming setting the stage for a homecoming of sorts, of, this is what the rhetoric of the Chinese Communist Party suggests, is that, these are people from one family and the Taiwanese should come home to the motherland. If there had been a potential for this, it's kind of, it has gone, and it has been contradicted by the increasingly violent, belligerent behavior of the Chinese Communist Party itself. So pilgrimages now are practices by which Taiwanese people create a sense of Taiwan as home, because this idea of what Taiwan is not really filled with content yet, because most of those people in my generation, which is the majority of people who I walked with, um, they learned in school more about China than they did about Taiwan. So they have kind of a bit of an ambiguous relationship to Taiwan. They know they're Taiwanese, but it's not entirely clear oftentimes to them what that actually means, because they might have heard more in school about China than about Taiwan. So going on pilgrimage for them is a way of affirming their link with Taiwan, and kind of create experiential knowledge where they often feel like scholarly knowledge has not given them enough to feel belonging. So that for that generation, that's the crucial generation. That's the people who started walking in probably in the 90s, 2000s. This is when pilgrimage is really growing in Taiwan at this time. For the next generation of younger people who are walking now, they kind of inherit pilgrimages, I think, as a very common way of creating familiarity with the countryside, of having a bit of a romantic idea, perhaps, of connecting with Taiwan. Because for them, they learn in school about Taiwan first. So for them, it's pretty clear that they're Taiwanese. Um, I don't see as much of an ambiguous kind of, not knowing where exactly to belong. But pilgrimages are part of the received culture, what they, what they see around themselves. So it's kind of, if they feel like doing something that is just walking around the place, or uh, familiarizing themselves with Taiwan, pilgrimages that's the kind of form they would go for.
I have a lot of thoughts, like competing thoughts that are zinging through my head as you're talking. One is it's so I'm struck by the idea that many of the people who have really grabbed on to these pilgrimages, particularly the Mazu ones, are the grandchildren of people who immigrated. Did I understand that correctly? Who came?
Let me think what generation this would be. Could be grandchildren, could be great grandchildren, probably, or yeah. So 4 generations approximately, 3, 4.
Well, so what is sort of bubbling up in my mind is that it's so the grandparents or great grandparents come to Taiwan, and then there's this goddess figure of Mazu, a deity, a feminine deity that is seen as a grandmother.
Mm.
And so in some ways, um, exists on a similar plane as the biological grandparents, but who is Taiwanese.
Mm.
And now resides, her home is Taiwan. I can see a very strong, powerful motivation to connect with this deity in Taiwan through these shrines. And so that was one thing that I was thinking about. How interesting is this, that the deity is also quite important to one's sense of being Taiwanese, because
Mhm.
the deity resides in this place, on this ground, in these shrines, and is re-energized through these pilgrimages to keep her alive,
And effective, yeah.
effective. Um, And then I also was thinking about the pilgrimage that you said goes around Taiwan, that there's a specific name, which is in some ways a way of creating a boundary of this homeland through the act of pilgrimage. And it seems, and you've written about this, so I'm not suggesting something novel here, but it seems to me that this is really important then for national identity and nationhood to continue these practices, because as these Taiwanese people that the
Mm.
pilgrims, are creating their homeland, they're doing so on multiple levels. They're creating boundaries through the practice of pilgrimage, around the island, but then they're also creating a web of identity that's dispersed and connected throughout the same territory. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so that is essentially the gist of what I'm suggesting, that pilgrimages are essential for nation building because, I heard some people say that creating a nation without or it yeah, how did they say it? It was essentially about filling something that otherwise would be hollow. You know, you kind of have to have cultural grounding, or the nation has to be grounded culturally. Often they wouldn't put it this abstract. This is a very abstract way of putting it, but what they were suggesting was essentially that, you can't just go around and kind of proclaim to be Taiwanese because it's meaningless. If this is only a political ploy, but it also needs to be kind of, you need to be able to touch it, to experience it in some form. This is where the cultural aspect comes in for me. And there's pilgrimages are not the only practices by which this possible hollow can be filled, but they're one of them. So other things would be, for example, the identification with and practices around democracy. That's another way of by which Taiwanese nation building distinguishes itself, especially from the PRC, where democracy, I don't want to dwell too much on democracy, but the act of voting or participating in different forms of democratic action is its own, almost kind of its own end. And with pilgrimages, this is kind of what I'm thinking and I'm trying to suggest is that this goes in actually in a three-dimensional way, in a different sense than voting does, or democratic actions, because as you said, put it quite nicely, and we can extend the web into a three-dimensional shape. It's not just that it's two-dimensionally on a flat plane, which is the land, but it extends through time as well. So this is kind of where what I mean by three-dimensionality comes in. That this is basically um, chronotopical. That this is it connects you to previous generations of people who have done this. People are very aware of the people of the previous generations in whose footsteps they walk. Because oftentimes you have multiple generations participating in the current pilgrimage. And so the older generation often shares with the younger generations, what pilgrimages were like in the past. You have photographs being shared, um, stories being told, and especially in the case of the Baishaton pilgrimage, where this has been an incredibly fast development. You still have people who are 50 years old, 60 years old today, who would tell me, but also younger people than me, because I'm kind of in between them, I guess. But they would tell younger people that, oh, we started out with, we were 100 people. This, we kind of had to rest, or we had to kind of stop working for that time, because it's a fishing village, and there's mostly agriculture at the time. So we kind of had to find. Not everyone could go. We had to make ways. To You had to find ways of taking time off. So pilgrimages do have this added component that you could. This really hard to fill in other ways. And the state actually recognizes that, because Mazu pilgrimages have become cultural heritage in the way it's been promoted by the state as kind of, representative of Taiwanese culture. Of course, there's an interesting contradiction, which for most Taiwanese doesn't really play out in their daily lives, but the on the international stage, the Mazu belief and customs, that's what it's called. It's enshrined in UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage on that list, but it has been enshrined there by the People's Republic of China, with it being located in Fujian, which is kind of an attempt to centralize the Mazu cult, geographically, and center it in China, and kind of connect the Taiwanese cult to the Chinese one. But for most Taiwanese people, that is not something that they're concerned with, because that's nothing experienced. So it's not part of their life world, really. But I think this spatiotemporal aspect is really important. And in this context, I should probably mention that I should correct myself from earlier, because the 3-4 generations that I meant, this is one population of Taiwan's Waishengren. This is the mainlanders who came about 4 generations ago, with Chiang Kai-shek in 1949. Most people who participate in pilgrimages are not mainlanders, even though that distinction between mainlanders and Taiwanese, Waishengren, it doesn't really resonate as much anymore today. Still, most people who participate in pilgrimages who I've met have been there for much longer than these 3-4 generations. So their families have been there for at least 200 years. So that's, I don't know, 10 generations or more. And they do, by way of their families, identify more with Taiwan, because with the mainlanders, this is a relatively recent phenomenon. And I haven't really looked at it systematically, how the descendants of the mainlanders who came with Chiang Kai-shek, how they relate to Mazu. And, I'm sure that many mainlanders participate in pilgrimages. It would be interesting to know, to actually approach them and talk about the idea of home and what going on the pilgrimage does for them. Because for them, especially the old mainlanders, for them, the idea of home is really fraught with tension, because for them, it was always China, and they always thought that they could go back to China. Their descendants might have, they might have a much stronger relationship with Taiwan. For them, China is more in the background, but that is something that I would have to look into. It's an expectation that I would have, so far as they are interested in the pilgrimages, that they might do it for these reasons. But I don't know at this point.
We'll have to come back and have another conversation after you have the opportunity to speak to these people.
Maybe after the summer.
That's right. You're going back this summer. Uh,
Yeah.
so on that topic of what you're doing in the upcoming summer, what other projects are you working on? I know you and I are in a book project together with our colleagues John Eade and Kinga Povadak. I hope I'm
Hmm.
saying the surname correctly. In a new edited volume on soundscapes of pilgrimage, and so I'm curious what your chapter is about for this publication.
Yeah. I was attuned to sound because during fieldwork, the PhD fieldwork, the main fieldwork I did was actually in Taipei. It wasn't with pilgrimages. It was with a group that plays music, religious music. So it's the music that you hear at temple festivals. It's called Bakwan in Chinese or Bakwan in Taiwanese. And so I learned to play that music. And um, I think because of that reason, I was just much more aware of sound and the presence of sound. In the chapter, I'm looking at soundscapes of pilgrimage, um, in particular with respect to why there is so much sound, or kind of sound in relation to other affective signs. So I apply the notion of signs following Charles Sanders Peirce, um, to understand signs as indexes, icons, or symbols, and sounds, especially in combination with other sign. They never come alone. It's always in combination with, especially sights, smells, kinesthetic feelings. Um, Sounds in particular work on the indexical and iconic level. So that's what I'm exploring. What types of connections sounds build for people, and especially the presence, the almost omnipresence of sound, because it's almost always really loud at pilgrimages. It's really hard even to find rest at night, because at night there's fireworks, because people are celebrating that Mazu came back. So if you're staying, if you want to rest, you have to stay in a temple. Often there's only place on the floor, and that's not, you won't really sleep on the floor, because I wasn't carrying around a mattress, for example. Um, but even then, it's just a few minutes, maybe an hour, but there's going to be sound constantly, and then the pilgrimage will start again. You only get rests of like up to 2 hours or something like that at night. Um, and so I'm interested in exploring, what sound is doing and how sound connects with uh, meaning, the meaning that people derive from participation. So how sound connects with ideas, more abstract ideas, such as belonging in a place and in a time, in with the nation as well, and ideas like that. So how kind of the affective side of more abstract notions of national belonging in the future. So when I'm going back, um, I'm mostly interested in exploring the gendered aspects of pilgrimage, because that's something that I didn't I didn't go into the field with a particular focus on it, but it was one of the outcomes of fieldwork that gender is actually a really interesting aspect to look at, especially um, because I was part of a group um, of LGBTQ plus worshippers of Mazu, and the connection that they have with the deity, because it's not the only such group, and it's relatively curious, why Mazu would be the the target of worship by people who identify as queer, but also find it important to continue traditional practices, even though these are often framed in a very patriarchal, conservative values framework, and how they try to change things, perceptions, and practices around pilgrimages, but not only pilgrimages, but just practices targeting deities like Mazu in general. And pilgrimages is just one of big, the very visible practices. So that's something that I want to explore more of, to see, um, the real life negotiation, because this group in particular, they reside in a very rural place, so not a place that has naturally high support for same-sex marriage, which was legalized in Taiwan in 2019, but is still a relatively contentious subject, and especially where there's a religious opposition. Religious mostly driven by Christian churches, but there is a religious-based, values-based counter movement against same-sex marriage. And for those people, they are kind of on the front line of the negotiation process on the countries in the countryside. So that's what I find really interesting about, what strategies, if any, do they use, what contextualized kind of messages can be sent, and how much do people know, and how much do people kind of not know or pretend not to know, not to see, because that's something that I found really interesting when I was there, but I didn't have the time to explore it in full depth. So I want to
Mhm.
do more of it.
I'm thinking about the work of Matthew Boisvert, who is an anthropologist and spent quite a long time working with the Hijra community in India. And there might be some interesting comparisons in these two pilgrimage contexts.
Yeah, I haven't looked into this honestly. So this is kind of I've mostly looked at it from a fieldwork
Mhm.
perspective. Yeah, the literature study still needs to come. This is like third gender or right
Yes.
type
Yes.
type relatively institutionalized roles. So what in Taiwan, what I was seeing at least, and this is not just playing out or it's actually mostly not playing out in a religious field, is more like that there is uh, that gender is kind of coming, that younger people are coming to present on a spectrum, on a gendered spectrum, rather than a clear binary or trinary. I don't know if you say trinary, but or a three-partite
Mhm.
setup, where zhongxing, which means kind of either between the genders or middle gender or sex, um, where this is becoming more of a thing, kind of an androgynous way of presenting oneself. So this is part of Taiwanese, I would almost say, mainstream culture, especially in the cities. So it's definitely something where gender representations have changed without bringing in an institutionalized, like socially sanctioned form in which men in particular can take on female roles or something of the sort. Um, Religion offers a lot of opportunities for things like cross-dressing and gender switching roles, for example. But this was actually more in the music and opera sphere than in the pilgrimages. So that I'm exploring with respect to mm, the other aspect of my fieldwork, which was with the music and the opera, because it was actually very common for people to switch genders in their operatic roles, and that seems to have a long tradition in Taiwan, in part because of necessity, in part because of structural conditions, because in the past it was only men who were playing in opera and were kind of performing, so they had to take on, or it's not a question of desire as much, I should say, whether or not they wanted to portray women. And in the intervening period, the last 50 years, this has kind of switched, where opera performance was a low status occupation, mostly done by women professionally, and they would kind of um, there were women who would excel at portraying male roles, masculine roles. And there's a little bit of that resonates today, because I often heard people saying that, a particular man, for example, was much better at impersonating women in an opera than any woman was, for example. But this is kind of still a type of essentializing. What I was more interested in is kind of, how this goes beyond the way of representation and more into what people were doing, how they were presenting themselves, and how they could, slowly by having the operatic role sort of bleed into their daily life, because most of what you do is rehearsal. It's not performance on stage with, dressed up in a female role, but you kind of do it in your everyday clothes. So I was more interested in how that happens actually in rehearsal and how people are able to negotiate a type of in-betweenness in this way. In between, where the kind of the indicators of gender are giving a bit of a mixed message. That's not as cannot easily put into one category or the other. That's what I found particularly interesting, because that might actually have repercussions in a society that in Taiwan tends to accept, unconventional or like in between forms of gender representation. How this relatively niche culture can influence culture at large and other, cultural expressions.
It seems like your focus on homecoming, uh, uh, or maybe more precisely, homecoming within liminal spaces, is a characteristic of your work, whether it is with the pilgrimages or with these other communities, the musical communities, the operatic communities that you've just talked about. And I'm wondering if that resonates for you.
I think that's a really interesting. Thank you for saying that. I haven't really thought about that, as kind of an overarching theme or something like that. But it is true that homecoming was is a good trope to talk about, several themes that connect, including the search for identity and, kind of for um, giving or developing an idea for why one should continue to pursue traditional practices. That all has a lot to do with kind of, grounding oneself in a particular time and a particular place. And that actually, it maybe that is because it did resonate from what a lot of people told me as kind of, their aspirations, their desires. And in part it is because, I mean, I experience it too, honestly. This is not only happening in Taiwan. I experienced that because I relocated from Boston to Prague. And so I was I was new to the city. And um, even if I'm moving within Prague, for example, to a new neighborhood, there's again this question, a new house, of making a home there, of making a community, getting to know people around me and kind of feeling embedded, socially embedded. That is really important. So it's probably something that almost that everyone can resonate to some extent. It's just that in the Taiwanese case, I think it's maybe more on top of people's minds and, influencing practices more directly. Whereas here, it doesn't, I don't really see a direct connection to what I do every day. But if I were to look deeper, perhaps there is a connection there as well with the foods I cook, for example, or something like that.
Or perhaps coming home to oneself. I mean, that is a form of homecoming. It
Mhm,
isn't
mhm.
solely about belonging externally and finding home amongst the external world, but also the homecoming that happens within the self. I think is important too.
Yeah, right. So if I may add that, I think in Taiwan, what struck me was kind of the relational nature of both the self and, coming to oneself, and, the way that this is always interconnected with uh, an environment in which it occurs, and kind of you create both simultaneously. You create yourself by embedding, or at the same time as you embed yourself in relation to other people. And this is, I don't know if it's more important in Taiwan than it is in other places, but Taiwan certainly is not a very individualized or individualistic place. Of course, there are individual tendencies, individualizing tendencies, especially in the cities. people don't always know their neighbors or not very well, but there's a lot of people in Taiwan in relatively small space. So you kind of have to interact more. It's a hot climate, so people tend to be outside more and tend to interact with each other, which all of that, I think, brings an atmosphere, a climate of sociality with it, which in Taiwan is I joke that it's almost impossible to be depressed in Taiwan or to be to be alone because it's really hard to not feel the impact of others around. And most Taiwanese are very social people as well who interact a lot. Uh, a joke that I have is kind of if two Taiwanese, were to be in an elevator together and the elevator got stuck, let's say for 20 minutes or something, and they finally come out of the elevator, they will know each other. They will be best friends after that. If you had two Germans in the elevator, they might have exchanged a few, functional phrases over, if whether one or the other knows what's going on in the elevator. Of course, these are this is stereotyping, but I was struck by how easy it is to get in touch with Taiwanese and how easy it is to kind of interact. And there's almost, I mean, this can have an oppressive side, of course, as well, because people are expected to be available socially and to deal with large crowds all the time. Like even pilgrimages don't give you much respite from the social environment. So I mean, it's not only oh, everyone's super happy about it. I'm sure.
Hmm. I'm really looking forward to reading your chapter in the Soundscapes book. I, the whole notion of sound and acoustics is fascinating, and I'm really pleased that John and Kinga have narrowed a focus and given us an opportunity to explore this further, both through the conference, the workshop, and in the volume.
Me too.
I'm exploring the absence of sound, so that's an interesting
Uh-huh.
idea also
It
because
was.
there's something that speaks loudly when there's a void.
Mhm. Yeah, can you say more about this?
Well, I'm looking at the absence of sound in specifically in World War One battlefields, and how this absence of sound is experienced by visitors or pilgrims as being an essential part of their experience at the site. So on one level, it is a direct contrast to what one could envision the sound of war being, loud, ever present, relentless, and this silence then contrasts that, and I think people are able to imagine what could have happened. None of us were present during World War One, but so what could have happened, and the fact that there is this absence of noise reinforces the idea that this is a place of peace, it's a place of tranquility, it's a place where we can consider actually that peace could happen, that it's possible. So it forms the acoustic backdrop for our reflective space, so that people can think about they can be in touch with their own thoughts. I think in a way that is different than what you're explaining, and have described in a pilgrimage environment where the sound is constantly, kind of pummeling the person, the pilgrim.
Hmm.
Also, there is kind of a neuropsychology about this, about how people perceive silence and what happens internally from a neuropsychological standpoint, which is what I'm also getting into in this chapter.
I can also ask a question
Sure.
if you want a
Yep.
little time to think about it, because I was wondering if you or the research on those neuropsychological parts of it, if they see sort of a cultural factors in there. In other words, is in Taiwan, if there is, the abundance of sound and there's almost no absence of it, does that mean that, the reflection on something important, does it either not happen or does it happen in different ways? And are we just, primed towards silence, a minute of silence here
It's a great
in
question.
other societies?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've not found any cultural comparisons. And it's important when thinking specifically about the context of World War I battlefields in Europe, specifically France and Belgium, because they're drawing a certain type of visitor, most often from Europe, from the United States, from Canada.
Mm.
And so, yes, I do think there may be some cultural priming to view the absence of sound as moments for reflection, and we've been conditioned to expect this in various either religious settings or commemorative and remembrance settings. So, yeah, it's a great question, and actually it prompts me to think, the next time I'm visiting these sites, I need to be asking more questions of the visitors and pilgrims about their maybe their cultural background, and how they're perceiving the silence in light of that.
Yeah. I'm just thinking that, only in terms of valuation, of course, the context matters a lot. And
Yes.
war memorials give you a different context from a religious procession or celebration. But in Taiwan, the relatively funny thing is that the absence of sound, so the absence of the sound sign, in other words, is actually indexing the failure of an event. Like because the event itself, people judge it by its social nature, and uh, the success of an event hinges on its ability to create something called 热闹 or heat and noise, which is really social heat, through lots of people coming together and speaking on top of each other and like rubbing their skin at each other. And this is, of course, this is a one context. Um, the thing is that there aren't really any, I think, war memorials in Taiwan, but there are memorials to victims of the White Terror of the KMT, for example. And this is an entirely different context. So here, not sure if there's any pilgrimage of some sort, but visits to places like Green Island, where there was one of the prisons, could be construed as, if people do it regularly. I don't really know about if anyone does, but um, if people do this as some form of pilgrimage and what silence does for them at this point, or if silence is actually one of the important factors of the experience for them. That would be an interesting, I think, it could be an interesting comparative thing.
Very fascinating to explore this in different areas of the world, for sure. Well, if we keep talking, we're going to create more studies and more ideas for more papers and conferences.
Yeah, hopefully that somebody picks up at some
Exactly.
point.
Yeah. I thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me about your research. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm especially thinking about this grandmother figure, a goddess, and I'll be thinking about that actually more beyond our conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. This was a lovely conversation. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed your feedback as well, and your really thoughtful questions. Really happy to have been here.